The email arrived on a Tuesday, a simple, sterile piece of digital correspondence that should have meant nothing. The subject line read, Invitation, Distinguished Alumni Speaker Series, Department of Aerospace Engineering, University of Toronto. My finger hovered over the delete key. I get a lot of these. But some faint, ghostly whisper from a past I thought I'd buried, made me open it. And there it was, the name of the department head, the point of contact for the event coordination. Professor Mark Davies. The name hit me not like a wave, but like the sudden, sickening drop of an elevator cable snapping. My office, a sleek glass box perched high above Seattle with views of the Space Needle and the relentless buzz of my company's mission control, suddenly felt suffocating. The hum of servers, the soft glow of holographic schematics floating above my desk, it all faded into a dull roar, replaced by the sharp, clear memory of a different room, a different hum, the lazy buzz of fluorescent lights in a cavernous university lecture hall, and the sound of my own voice, small and broken. 10 years. A decade of my life spent building, creating, pushing the boundaries of what is possible, and yet, in that single moment, I was reduced to a 19-year-old girl again, feeling the heat of 100 eyes on me, my throat closing up, my words, my carefully prepared, intelligent words, twisting into something ugly and foreign under his mocking gaze. They say success is the best revenge. It's a nice, tidy saying, something you put on a coffee mug. But it's a lie. Revenge is a hollow, burning thing, and I'd never had the stomach for it. No, this wasn't about revenge. This was about something else entirely. This was about a ghost I needed to lay to rest. This was about the silence he forced upon me, and the voice I had spent 10 years forging in the fires of that silence. I am Dr. Anya Sharma. I am the founder and CEO of Ether Dynamics, a company that is pioneering the next generation of ion propulsion systems for deep space exploration. My work has been featured in Scientific American, I've consulted for NASA and the ESA, and my team is on the cusp of making interplanetary travel a tangible reality within our lifetimes. But before I was any of that, I was just a girl from a small town outside Mumbai, who landed in a Toronto winter with 2 suitcases, a scholarship, and a dream that felt too big for my body. My father saw me off at the airport, his eyes gleaming with a pride so fierce it was almost painful to look at. Beta, he said, his hand, calloused from a lifetime of fixing car engines, squeezing mine. You are carrying our name, our dreams, with you. Make them hear you. He pressed a small, cold piece of metal into my palm. It was an old, worn bolt from the first engine he ever rebuilt. For grounding, he said with a watery smile. So you never forget where you started, and so you always have a piece of home to hold on to. I clutched that bolt so tightly it left an imprint on my skin for hours. The Canada I arrived in was a shock of cold air and blinding whiteness. The snow, which I had only seen in pictures, was a marvel. The sheer, organized quiet of the city was unnerving. And the people, so polite, so reserved. I felt loud, my very presence an intrusion. My accent, which I had never once considered, became a wall between me and everything I wanted to be. At the grocery store, the word tomato would earn me a blank stare. In the dormitory, my attempts at conversation were met with polite, confused smiles. I started to practice in front of the mirror, twisting my tongue around the flat Canadian O, the hard T. I felt like I was sanding down my own edges, trying to fit into a slot I was never meant for. But the classroom was my sanctuary. Here, the language was universal. It was the language of mathematics, of physics, of numbers and equations that sang the same song in any tongue. I could lose myself in the elegant dance of calculus, the profound truths of Newtonian mechanics. In Aerospace 101, I was in my element. I devoured the textbooks, I aced the problem sets. I felt, for the first time, a flicker of belonging. My mind worked here. It was the one part of me that hadn't made the journey across the ocean, it was already home. Professor Mark Davies was a young, charismatic lecturer, fresh out of his own PhD and already building a reputation. He had a way of making complex topics seem accessible, even exciting. He'd crack jokes, pace the stage, his passion for fluid dynamics and propulsion systems infectious. I admired him. I sat in the third row, every lecture, my notebook filled with meticulous notes, my hand always ready to shoot up with a question, an answer. The day it happened, we were discussing the fundamental principles of rocket engine efficiency. The specific impulse, the thrust-to-weight ratio. It was a topic I had read about extensively, a concept I found beautiful in its simplicity and power. Professor Davies posed a particularly tricky problem, one that involved a nuanced understanding of the Tsiolkovsky rocket equation. The room fell silent. I saw the gears turning in the heads of my classmates, but no one ventured an answer. My heart started to thump against my ribs. I knew the answer. I had derived it 3 different ways in my notes just the night before. This was my moment. This was me, making them hear me. I raised my hand. Professor Davies's eyes scanned the room and landed on me. A slight, almost imperceptible frown flickered across his face. Yes, he said, his tone flat. The young lady in the third row. I took a deep breath, my palm slick with sweat. The key is to consider the effective exhaust velocity in relation to the propellant mass fraction, I began, my voice trembling slightly with nerves. If we integrate the equation of motion, we see that the delta V is directly proportional to. I didn't get to finish. Whoa, slow down there, Professor Davies interrupted, holding up a hand. A smirk played on his lips. He took a step closer, tilting his head. I'm sorry, I'm not sure I caught any of that. Could you translate? For the rest of the class? A few snickers rippled through the lecture hall. My face burned. I said, the delta V is. No, he said, his voice dripping with a mockery so casual it was devastating. The accent. It's very thick. Perhaps you could try it again, but in English this time? The world shrank to the space between his mocking eyes and my burning face. The snickers grew into open laughter. My words, my carefully constructed, technically perfect answer, had been reduced to a punchline. They weren't hearing the logic, the understanding. They were only hearing the music of my homeland, and he had just told them it was noise. I tried to speak again, to push the words out, but my throat had sealed shut. The equations in my head, once so clear and bright, shattered into a million meaningless symbols. All I could manage was a strangled, never mind. I dropped my gaze to my notebook, the blur of ink on the page mirroring the blur of tears in my eyes. I spent the rest of the lecture staring at a single point on the desk, the hum of the lights now a deafening condemnation. I didn't hear another word he said. After class, I rushed out, my head down, weaving through the crowd of students as if they were a forest of judgment. I heard a few muttered words, so harsh, and someone else, but she was hard to understand. Their pity was almost worse than the mockery. I found a deserted stairwell in the oldest part of the campus and sat on the cold, concrete steps, finally letting the hot, silent tears fall. I cried for my father, for the pride I had betrayed. I cried for the dream that now felt like a delusion. I cried for the girl who thought her mind was enough, only to discover that her voice was all anyone seemed to care about. I took the worn bolt from my pocket, the one my father had given me. It felt cold and heavy. A piece of home. A reminder of where I came from. In that moment, it felt less like a grounding force and more like an anchor, tying me to a place I could never truly escape. Make them hear you, he had said. But what was the point if they only listened to how you spoke, and not to what you were saying? That was the day the silence began. I stopped raising my hand in Professor Davies's class. I stopped speaking up in any of my classes. I became a ghost, a pair of ears and a scribbling hand. I buried myself in my work, my grades becoming my only voice, a silent, perfect scream of A+ that echoed in the emptiness of my social life. The lively, curious girl from India was gone, replaced by a studious, solitary figure always seen with her head in a book, always rushing away after lectures. The loneliness was a physical ache. I'd call home, and my mother would chatter about the neighbors, the monsoons, the price of lentils. I'd listen, my throat tight with all the things I couldn't tell her. I couldn't tell her about the cold that seeped into my bones, or the loneliness that was even colder. I couldn't tell her that the world she and my father had sacrificed so much for was a place where their daughter felt invisible. So, I lied. I told them I had made friends, that my professors were wonderful, that Canada was everything I had dreamed. The only place I found a semblance of peace was the university library's periodicals section. It was there, amidst the dusty smell of old paper and the quiet rustle of pages, that I discovered her. Dr. Kalpana Chawla. An Indian-born aerospace engineer and NASA astronaut. I read every article, every interview I could find. I learned about her journey from Cornell to Houston, about the challenges she faced, the prejudices she undoubtedly overcame. And then, I found a quote from her that would become my mantra, a line I copied onto a note card and pinned above my desk: "The path from dreams to success does exist. May you have the vision to find it, the courage to get onto it, and the perseverance to follow it." Perseverance. It was a quieter, more resilient word than revenge. It wasn't about proving him wrong, it was about proving myself right. Kalpana Chawla hadn't silenced her accent, she had let her work speak with such volume that her voice became impossible to ignore. That was the path. That was the vision. My third year, I switched my major. I left the large, impersonal lectures of the general engineering department and plunged into the intense, hands-on world of the aerospace engineering program. It was a smaller cohort, a family of sorts, united by a shared, slightly insane passion for things that flew. And it was here I met Dr. Evelyn Reed. Dr. Reed was everything Professor Davies was not. She was in her 60s, with a wild mane of gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She spoke precisely, demanded excellence, and had a zero-tolerance policy for what she called intellectual laziness. In her propulsion systems lab, there was no room for ego, only for data and results. For the first few weeks, I was my usual silent self. I did the work, I ran the simulations, I wrote the reports. But Dr. Reed noticed. She had a way of circling the lab, observing, her hands clasped behind her back. One afternoon, I was troubleshooting a faulty pressure sensor in a small-scale rocket engine test stand. I'd been at it for an hour, my frustration mounting. Everyone else had packed up and left. "Problem, Ms. Sharma?" Dr. Reed's voice was calm, direct. I jumped, startled. "The sensor, Dr. Reed. The readings are erratic. I think the connection is faulty." She didn't offer to fix it. She didn't tell me what to do. She simply said, "Explain your diagnostic process to me." I hesitated. The old fear gripped me. My accent. My words. But her gaze was steady, expectant. It held no mockery, only a genuine curiosity. So, I began to speak, haltingly at first, then with growing confidence as I detailed the steps I had taken, the voltages I had checked, the possible failure modes I had considered. When I finished, she was silent for a moment. Then she nodded. "A thorough analysis. You have a good mind for systems, Ms. Sharma. But a mind is useless if it stays locked inside. Your ideas have no weight, no impact, until you give them a voice." She pointed a finger at the stubborn sensor. "Now, tell me what you think the solution is." Out loud. That was the moment the dam broke. With Dr. Reed's quiet, unwavering insistence, I began to speak again. In her lab, my voice was just a voice. My ideas were just ideas. They were judged on their merit, not their packaging. She became my mentor, my champion. She saw the fire that Mark Davies had tried to drown, and she handed me the bellows. She encouraged me to apply for a prestigious undergraduate research grant. I did, and I won. The project was on optimizing Hall-effect thruster configurations, the very early, clumsy ancestor of the technology my company now perfects. That grant, that research, was my ticket. It led to a published paper, my name in a real scientific journal. It led to a full-ride scholarship for my master's at Caltech. When the acceptance letter came, I cried. This time, they were tears of relief, of vindication. I was leaving. I was escaping the shadow of that lecture hall. Saying goodbye to Dr. Reed was hard. We stood in her office, surrounded by models of satellites and framed photos of rocket launches. "You're going to do remarkable things, Anya," she said, using my first name for the first time. "Don't let anyone, make you feel small again. Your voice is your strength. Your perspective, your unique way of seeing a problem, is your greatest asset. Never apologize for it." I hugged her, this woman who had given me back my voice. As I packed my bags for California, I felt a sense of closure. Toronto, with its cold winters and painful memories, was behind me. I was moving towards the sun, towards a future where my work would be my defining feature. Caltech was a different universe. It was a crucible of the brightest, most ambitious minds from every corner of the globe. Here, accents were a symphony, not a liability. A thick Russian accent debated orbital mechanics with a rapid-fire Japanese one. A drawling Texan collaborated with a precise German on materials science. Your voice was part of your identity, yes, but it was the ideas that came out of it that commanded respect. I thrived. I worked 18-hour days in the lab, fueled by cheap coffee and a burning purpose. I was no longer the silent, studious ghost. I was a force. I argued my points in seminars, I defended my thesis proposals with passion, I led my research team with a quiet authority I didn't know I possessed. The ghost of Mark Davies still whispered sometimes, in moments of self-doubt, but his voice was growing fainter, drowned out by the roar of test fires and the applause at conferences. It was during my PhD that the kernel of the idea for ether dynamics was born. I was frustrated with the limitations of current chemical propulsion for deep space missions. The fuel mass was too high, the travel times too long. I became obsessed with ion propulsion, with the idea of using electric fields to accelerate ions to incredible speeds, creating a tiny, but incredibly efficient, thrust. Everyone said it was a niche technology, good for stabilizing satellites, but never for primary propulsion. They said it was too weak, too slow to build up speed. But I saw something else. I saw a puzzle. And my mind, the mind that had once found solace in the clean lines of calculus, began working on it. I spent nights scribbling on whiteboards, running simulations that crashed the university's servers. I found a flaw in the conventional design of the ionization chambers, a way to increase the plasma density without causing catastrophic erosion. It was a breakthrough. A small one, but it was mine. My doctoral advisor urged me to patent it. Then a venture capital firm, one that specialized in moonshot technologies, came knocking. They had heard about the crazy Indian grad student who was trying to reinvent the space engine. I pitched my idea to a room full of men in suits who looked like they'd never touched a wrench in their lives. I was nervous, my heart hammering. But as I began to speak, as I explained the physics, the potential, the sheer rightness of the solution, I saw their skepticism turn to interest, then to excitement. I remembered my father's words. Make them hear you. And I did. I didn't try to hide my accent. I didn't try to sound like them. I sounded like me, Dr. Anya Sharma, an expert in her field. They heard the conviction in my voice, the fire in my eyes, the undeniable power of the numbers on the screen. They invested. Ether Dynamics was born in a rented garage in Silicon Valley, a cliché I embraced wholeheartedly. The first 5 years were a blur of struggle that made my university days look like a vacation. We were constantly on the brink of failure. A test engine would explode, taking months of work and a significant chunk of our funding with it. A key engineer would quit. We lived on a diet of instant noodles and existential dread. I missed my sister's wedding. I got the frantic, tearful call from her the morning of, just as I was heading into a make-or-break meeting with our board. I saw the photos later on social media, her, radiant in red silk, surrounded by family, a space where I should have been. There was an empty chair next to my aging parents. The guilt was a physical weight in my chest. I had sacrificed moments I could never get back for a dream that seemed determined to kill me. Through it all, I held on to my father's bolt. It sat on my desk, a paperweight for the mountains of schematics and financial reports. It reminded me of his hands, of the tangible, real-world power of engineering. It reminded me that every complex machine, every starship, begins with a simple, well-made part. It grounded me. And then, we had our breakthrough. Engine Test 47. We called it Surya, the sun. It was a complete redesign, incorporating everything we had learned from our countless failures. The day of the test, the air in the garage was thick with tension. My team, a handful of brilliant, tired believers, stood behind the safety glass. I gave the command to ignite. There was no roar. No violent flame. Just a soft, ethereal blue glow from the thruster nozzle, a hum of power. The laser interferometer measured the thrust. It was stable. It was efficient. It was 10 times more powerful than any comparable ion thruster ever built. We had done it. We had turned a textbook theory into a working, revolutionary engine. The silence after we shut it down was profound. And then, we erupted. We cheered, we hugged, we cried. In that moment, every missed wedding, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt, was worth it. We had built a star in a bottle. Success, after that, came not in a trickle, but a flood. The aerospace world took notice. Contracts poured in. We moved out of the garage and into the sleek Seattle headquarters. My face was on the cover of magazines. I was invited to speak at the world's most prestigious forums. I had done it. I had built a legacy from a dream. And then, the email from Toronto arrived. From Professor Mark Davies's department. Sitting in my quiet office, the ghost of my 19-year-old self trembling beside me, I knew what I had to do. This wasn't an invitation, it was a summons from the past. A circle that needed to be closed. I clicked reply. I typed, "Thank you for the invitation. I am honored to accept. Please send the details. Sincerely, Dr. Anya Sharma." The weeks that followed were a strange duality. I was simultaneously the powerful CEO preparing for a major speaking engagement and the nervous student steeling herself for a return to the scene of her deepest humiliation. The night before my flight to Toronto, I couldn't sleep. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of my apartment, looking out at the glittering lights of Seattle, the city that had embraced my ambition. I took my father's bolt from my pocket, its edges worn smooth from a decade of my anxious touch. "Well, Papa," I whispered to the night sky, "I'm going back. I'm going to make them hear me." The University of Toronto campus was both familiar and alien. The old stone buildings were the same, but I was different. I was no longer a spectator, I was a guest of honor. A young, eager PhD student met me at the department office, her eyes wide with awe. "Dr. Sharma, it's such an incredible honor. I've read all your papers on the magnetoplasmodynamic thrusters. Your work it's inspirational." I smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here." And in that moment, I realized it was true. I was led to a green room behind the main auditorium. It was the same one visiting speakers had used a decade ago. I remembered bringing a cup of water to one, a famous physicist, my hands shaking. Now, I was the one being offered water. The department head would be in to greet me shortly before the lecture, the student informed me. I sat on a small sofa, smoothing the fabric of my tailored navy blue suit. I had chosen it carefully. It was professional, powerful, but it was also the color of the deep sky, the ocean, the infinite realm my engines were designed to conquer. I closed my eyes, centering myself, running through the key points of my presentation in my mind. The door opened. I opened my eyes. And there he was. Professor Mark Davies. He had aged. There were lines around his eyes, a touch of gray at his temples. He was still handsome, still carried that air of academic confidence, but it seemed thinner now, more fragile. He was holding a folder, a polite, professional smile on his face. Dr. Sharma, welcome. I'm Professor Mark Davies, the head of the department. We are so delighted you could join us. His voice was exactly as I remembered it, the same cadence, the same tone he used to charm a lecture hall. He extended his hand. I stood up, slowly, and took it. My grip was firm, steady. His eyes met mine, and for a fraction of a second, I saw it. A flicker of confusion, then a dawning, horrifying recognition. The polite smile froze, then faltered. His eyes darted over my face, searching for the girl he'd once silenced in the third row. He found her, reflected back at him in the composed, successful woman standing before him. The color drained from his face. The folder in his hand trembled slightly. Dr. Sharma. He began again, but his voice had lost its smoothness. It was strained. Professor Davies, I said, my voice calm, clear, and yes, still carrying the melodic lilt of my homeland. It's a pleasure to be back. The words hung in the air between us, simple and devastating. Back. He knew. He knew exactly who I was. The silence that followed was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a debt, not of revenge, but of acknowledgement, being paid in full. He tried to recover, to slip back into his role as the gracious host. The turnout is exceptional. We've had to set up an overflow room. Your work on the Ether-V drive has caused quite a stir. I'm glad to hear it, I said, my tone still pleasant, professional. I was not going to give him the satisfaction of seeing my old hurt. I was not that girl anymore. I was the one holding all the cards. He cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. Well, I'll let you prepare. We'll begin in about 10 minutes. He almost fled the room, the door clicking shut behind him with a soft, final sound. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My heart was pounding, but it was a triumphant rhythm. I had faced my ghost, and he had been just a man, a fallible, mortal man, shrinking in the shadow of what I had built. 10 minutes later, I walked onto the stage of the same large auditorium I had once scurried out of in shame. The room fell silent, then erupted into applause. It was a wall of sound, respectful, eager. The hall was packed, every seat taken, students and faculty lining the walls. Lights from phones and cameras twinkled in the darkness. I walked to the center of the stage, to the podium, and placed my notes down. I looked out at the sea of faces, young, bright, full of potential. And then, I saw him. Professor Davies was sitting in the front row, off to the side. He was trying to look composed, but his arms were crossed tightly over his chest, a defensive posture. Our eyes met for a brief, electric moment. He looked away first. I leaned into the microphone. My voice, my Indian-accented English, filled the vast hall, clear and confident. Good afternoon, I began. It is a true honor to be here, back at the University of Toronto, a place that holds many memories for me. I paused, letting the words settle. I could feel his discomfort from the front row. My talk today is about the future of interstellar travel. But every future has a past. Every engine fire begins with a spark. I clicked the remote in my hand, and the massive screen behind me lit up with a simple, powerful image, the worn, metal bolt from my father's first engine. A few people in this room might remember me, I continued, my gaze sweeping over the audience, deliberately grazing past Professor Davies. 10 years ago, I was a student here. I sat in these very seats. I was passionate, I was driven, and I was very, very quiet. A ripple of curious laughter went through the crowd. I became quiet because I was taught a lesson. I was taught that my voice, the particular sound of it, was a distraction. That my ideas were less valuable because of the accent they were wrapped in. I was told, in no uncertain terms, to be silent. The auditorium was utterly still now. You could have heard a pin drop. I didn't look at Professor Davies, but I could feel the heat of his shame from where I stood. So, I buried myself in my work, I said, my voice softening. I found my voice not in a lecture hall, but in a lab. I found it in the data, in the simulations, in the beautiful, brutal logic of physics. And I learned something important. Your voice is not just the sound you make. It is the work you do. It is the problems you solve. It is the legacy you build. It is the fire you carry inside you, a fire that no one, no matter how powerful they seem, can ever extinguish. I clicked the remote again. The bulb was replaced by the stunning, blue glow of our Surya ion engine, a miniature star contained by magnetic fields. This, I said, my voice swelling with a pride I made no effort to conceal, is my voice. This is what I have to say. I launched into my presentation. I spoke for an hour, taking them on a journey from the basic principles of ion propulsion to the cutting-edge innovations of ether dynamics. I spoke of failure, of perseverance, of the thousands of tiny breakthroughs that lead to one giant leap. I was in my element. This was my language. This was my stage. I was no longer the silenced student, I was the expert, the pioneer, the one they had all come to hear. When I finished, the applause was thunderous. It was a standing ovation. Students were cheering, their faces alight with inspiration. I saw Dr. Reed in the second row, clapping, her eyes shining with tears of pride. She had known. She had always known this day would come. I took a bow, my heart full to bursting. As the applause finally began to subside, I opened the floor to questions. Hands shot up everywhere. I answered them all, technical questions about electrode erosion, philosophical questions about the ethics of space colonization, personal questions about being a woman in a male-dominated field. I answered with honesty, with humor, with the hard-won wisdom of my journey. And then, the last hand. It was from the front row. Professor Mark Davies. The room grew quiet again, the air thick with anticipation. He stood up, a microphone handed to him by a student. He looked pale, older than he had just an hour before. Dr. Sharma, he began, his voice unsteady. He cleared his throat. Thank you for a remarkable presentation. He paused, gathering his words, his eyes fixed on some point on the floor before finally lifting them to meet mine. There was no mockery there now. Only a profound, unsettling humility. I have a question, he said. Not about the technology. It's more personal. He took a deep breath. What advice would you give to educators? To those of us tasked with guiding young minds? How can we avoid stifling the very voices we are meant to nurture? The question hung in the air, a public confession, a plea for absolution. The entire auditorium waited for my response. I looked at him, this man who had been the villain of my story for so long. I saw not a monster, but a flawed human being, finally confronting the consequence of a careless, cruel moment. And I felt no anger. I felt a strange, powerful sense of pity. I smiled, a small, gentle smile. That's a very important question, Professor, I said, my voice soft but carrying to every corner of the room. The advice I would give is this: listen. Truly listen. Don't just hear the accent, the gender, the age, the color of the skin. Listen to the idea. Listen for the fire. Because talent, brilliance, and world-changing ideas, they don't always come in the package you expect. Your job isn't to judge the wrapping paper. Your job is to help unwrap the gift. I held his gaze for a long moment. He gave a slow, shaky nod, his shoulders slumping in what looked like both defeat and relief. He had his answer. Thank you, he whispered into the microphone, before sitting down, his head bowed. The event concluded. I was swarmed by students, their questions eager, their admiration genuine. I signed autographs, took selfies, my hand aching from handshakes. Through the crowd, I saw Professor Davies slip out a side door, alone. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clean. As if a wound I'd been carrying for a decade had finally been lanced and could now properly heal. Later, as I was packing my briefcase backstage, Dr. Reed found me. She pulled me into a fierce hug. "I am so proud of you, Anya," she whispered. "You were magnificent. You didn't just give a speech. You taught a masterclass in grace." "That's because I had a magnificent teacher," I replied, hugging her back tightly. On the flight back to Seattle, I looked out the window at the endless expanse of clouds below. I thought about the journey. The scared girl on the cold stairwell. The determined student in Dr. Reed's lab. The exhausted founder in the garage. And now, the woman who had returned, not for revenge, but for reconciliation with her own past. I took my father's bolt from my pocket one last time. It felt different in my hand. It no longer felt like an anchor. It felt like a compass. It had guided me home, not to a place, but to myself. It had reminded me of my roots, of the simple, sturdy strength I came from, a strength that had allowed me to build engines that could touch the stars. The plane broke through the clouds into the brilliant, clear sunshine above. The sky was a boundless, beautiful blue. My father was right. I had carried our name, our dreams. And I had, finally, made them hear me. Not by silencing who I was, but by letting my success, my voice, speak with a volume that drowned out any insult, forever. The silence was gone. All that was left was the roar of what was to come.